Good morning, good afternoon, and also good evening. We have a very international audience here today. My name is Isabella. I'm the CMO of Raynet, and I would really like to welcome you to our exclusive live webinar on current and future challenges in discovery and inventory management. During the presentation, you will be muted, but if you have any questions or want to leave a comment, just use the question panel, and we will be happy to answer all your questions in the following Q&A session afterwards. So, at my side, I would like to welcome Ragip Aydin, Raynet's founder and managing director, and joining us also live directly from the US, Roger Williams. He is the VP analyst of Gartner, one of the largest companies for market research and analysis of IT developments. We are very proud to have won so many participants for this topic. Why do we have this webinar today? Of course, we want to support our customers, partners, and prospects in understanding what are the challenges they will face with regards to discovery and inventory management. As a software vendor, we want to make sure that you are fully up to speed about how these challenges are evolving, but more importantly, how you can be prepared and overcome them. To help us to do this, we invited Roger to explain what he and Gartner see as the key points to think about in this regards. So, many thanks and advice to these two speakers today, and we are very excited about the next hour. I hereby hand over to Ragip.
Thank you, Isabella. Just a few words from my side to our company, to Raynet. A lot of customers and partners also participating in this session know this, but for those who are new to Raynet and to us, just few words. We as Raynet are specialized in the areas of unified endpoint management, software packaging, but last but not least, in this specific area, software asset management, and go deeper to discovery inventory. This is one of our specialties in the area of software management. Over 20 years with unique products and services, and more than 100 employees on the market. As an international software company with subsidiaries worldwide, and also today proud to announce that we opened this year in Tokyo and in Istanbul our offices. We are very happy to make this session the first one in that case for you. But with our partners and customers like Microsoft, Aspera, Deloitte, Accenture, but especially also with Gartner's global view, we are developing the future solutions in that area, and especially also in that area for you. Therefore, the buzzwords or the keywords are here. The driving force from our point of view is connectivity. And the whole world is connected. This is our statement, and this is how we see this in the future, and where we are working in that area for you. This is one part, but more important, I think, the view from companies like Gartner, especially. One of the key analysts here from Roger is very important, and therefore you will hear the next hour not Ragip. You will hear Roger and his thinking about this topic. I can give over now to Roger to show us what is in the area of discovery inventory, and then come back to us.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Ragip, and welcome to everyone who's joined us for the webinar today. Many of the needs that we see around this space. And this whole notion of connectivity is an important one because in many circumstances, our ability to be able to work with the data that we have is a huge challenge for many of our organizations. So we're commonly asked questions like, what discovery tools should we buy? What's the right discovery tool for our needs? And these are questions that come up in all geographies, all markets, and in a wide variety of situations. And this is one of those areas where the more specific that we can be about our needs, the more likely it is that we can be successful. And how I would say structure this is that this notion of what discovery means is something that we have to start by understanding what our goals are for our work. When we look at the notion of discovery, in many cases, we're going to have data that is in place from many different sources within our organizations. So we may have a service management team that is putting data into an IT service management tool such as BMC Helix or ServiceNow, Ivanti, Fresh Service, or other products like those. We may also have tools that we're using for purposes like software asset management or tools that we're using for monitoring, for security. All of these different areas have a need for discovery because for us to be able, for example, to secure the systems that we have in our environment and make sure that we don't introduce unexpected vulnerabilities that could compromise the security of our systems, we first have to know exactly what systems we have to be able to answer that question. Our ability to get the information that we need depends on the purposes that we're using for our data. And when we talk to organizations that start from a very general standpoint of just trying to say, I need to be able to discover everything and know all about all of my systems, we tend to find that those sorts of approaches don't work very well. Quite simply, trying to do everything to start, especially, is a very difficult proposition. What we have to do is to make sure that we understand what it is that we need to be successful. And we want to make use of the tools that we have in place and also supplement that. Tools play an important part of the equation in our efforts because with the variety of systems that we have and the pace of change that we see nowadays, even if our environment is something that we might consider to be a bit more traditional, the amount of effort that's required to maintain the data and to keep up with it is one that will very quickly dwarf the resources that we often have for that purpose. So our need to make use of the data that we already have, invest in the areas where we have gaps or where there are significant struggles with gathering the data that we need, and ultimately being able to use that information in order to make better decisions around our assets and the systems that we have in our environment are absolutely critical for our success. So how we find the data is by making use of what we have and then investing in other resources to address the gaps related specifically to our goals. This also relates to a common question that we have is, since we have many different tools that are in place, how do we ensure that they cover everything? Well, we would argue that the goal of covering everything is not a useful goal for most organizations. A better question to ask if you're thinking about investing in discovery, tooling, and processes and staffing for support of this work is, are we covering the things that we need to support our goals? Because if we're not going to use that information for improving something that we have within our organizations, then that data is not going to provide value to us. So ultimately, the benefits that we get from any of this work have to translate into changes and improvements that we make within our environments. One of the areas that we often get asked about when we talk about discovery is this topic of dependency mapping. And in many cases, when clients ask us about dependency mapping, there's some different challenges that we see around this. And how you collect the data to support dependency mapping, again, depends on what your purposes are and what the goals are for your efforts. Now, if our intent is just to be able to have some sort of a sense of what things are connected to what within our environment, Infrastructure dependency mapping is something that tools can provide us with and generally will work very well. So being able to see that there is a server connected to specific network devices that have a linkage to switches and storage units and other items within our environment is a fairly straightforward proposition, although there are always nuances, which we'll talk about a bit later in how we approach that. But for some organizations, of course, they are looking to understand more than just the linkages between systems. They want to actually understand what we would refer to as application dependencies. So being able to start from a given application and to be able to say, what are the different servers, network devices, databases, and other systems that ultimately support that application performing properly within the environment. That sort of application dependency mapping requires more nuance and capabilities than just direct infrastructure mapping, because ultimately we need to be able to speak to not only what things are connected together, but also are they connected together in the right way for this application to be able to function correctly. Now, this can help us to answer more questions around things like, is this application performing the way that it should, or if we have chronic slowness, for instance, what are the items that are likely contributing to that? And again, there are many tools in the marketplace that can help us with answering those questions. We do sometimes talk to organizations that are looking to do what we would call service dependency mapping. And this is the notion of being able to start from a particular business service or capability or offering and to be able to say, what are the specific components within our environment that support that particular business service? So can we speak to the downtime that we might have with a particular database or a server and be able to link that to the impact that it had on the business service? Now, in order to be able to create this sort of a map, we have to go beyond what tooling can provide within our environment, because ultimately where we have to start from for that question is, what are the business services and the offerings that we actually have within our environment? That usually would come from an enterprise architecture or business architecture practice that would do some modeling around those systems in order to understand what offerings that we have and then how that connects to the different applications that support them. If we have that in place, then we can link that to the application dependency mapping that we talked about earlier to be able to start to connect those pieces together and to be able to see that full picture. But having a tool that can develop that full stack is not something that we see today within the environment. In short, if we're looking at dependency mapping as a key capability for our discovery work, we need to make sure that we understand what dependency mapping can do for us and what discovery and dependency mapping won't do for us around those specific areas. Now, I mentioned earlier that, of course, many tools will be in use for supporting this work, and making use of both existing systems and new investments makes sense for our organization. That then introduces a different challenge, and this is one that we often see kill efforts that end up resulting in very little value from investments within this space, and that is the topic of normalization. And what we mean by normalization is something that on the surface appears very simple. How do I know whenever I'm taking data from tool A, tool B, and tool C, if I'm referring to a particular PC in each of those data sets, that I am able to determine that I'm talking about the same PC in each environment, or am I talking about a different PC? This is one of those topics that, while it appears simple on the surface, the rules in place to be able to do this well can get extremely complex. The more data sources that we introduce into our environment, the more difficult the normalization becomes. And of course, the issue isn't limited to just understanding duplication of systems within our environment. Consider this example. If we are looking for the applications that we have deployed within our environment, and we see that one tool says that we have Adobe Acrobat X installed on this particular system, and another tool tells us that we have Adobe Acrobat installed on that system. Are those referring to the same products, or are those referring to two different products? And if we were to bring that data together, if they are supposed to refer to the same product, which name should we use? What this begins to introduce is a challenge of being able to make sense of the data that we're bringing together from different systems. So even if we're able to remove all of the duplicates that we might have between our items, we may still run into an issue where we have very different names that are being used in different spaces. And of course, if we're looking for information about servers in our environment and all that we can see are a bunch of IP addresses or very cryptic codes related to the MAC address or the serial number of those systems, it may significantly slow down our troubleshooting if what we're trying to determine is which server may be causing an issue at that particular moment. We can also run into issues related to how hardware elements are represented on those systems. So for instance, I've seen data sources where when we look at one data source, we see that a particular server has 4 cores installed on its for a server, while another data source says that it has more than 2, that it's a multi-core system. Both of those systems are technically correct, but which set of data is actually useful for the specific challenges that we have? Being able to make sense of which data to use in those circumstances can also be quite difficult. The key points to remember around normalization are that when we use multiple tools, we have to think about how the data between those systems will come together and how we can make use of it effectively. That we may end up with risks of duplication and multiple counting of data if we don't do normalization well, and that it will likely make the data more difficult to work with the more data sources that we use. Now, there are tools and systems in the market that can help with being able to address these challenges, but if we don't plan for them up front and explicitly understand the challenges around normalization and make sure that we are testing and reviewing for those considerations as we undertake our discovery efforts, we're likely to run into situations where the value that we're actually able to achieve is not as high as we hoped because our staff are burdened with trying to make sense of different views of data, different systems, removing duplicates, and other challenges that relate to this. Another area that becomes commonly a challenge around this is around making sure that we have access to the data that we need to be able to work through these different tools. So think about, for instance, that we often run into the question of, should I adopt an agent-based approach to discovery, or should I only use agentless systems? And as you can expect, I've talked to a lot of teams over the years that are very passionately in one camp or the other related to this topic. Generally speaking, of course, where we see that there are very strong opinions around different areas, there's an element of truth in all those areas. And this is certainly one of those cases. There are different people that have different concerns depending on the discovery approach that we use. So for instance, agent-based systems are ones that often make infrastructure teams very nervous. So those that own your servers, your databases, and other systems may be concerned that the agents that you're deploying to those systems may overburden those tools, especially if we're looking at older systems that may not necessarily have a lot of spare capacity for being able to operate the agent effectively. While we're able to get more data from those agents, the trade-offs in terms of performance may be something that we can't tolerate as an organization. Now, on the other hand, if for those reasons we then look more at agentless solutions, then our security teams start to get very concerned because in general, security teams do not like it whenever there are tools that have access to all of your systems that may use a shared credential in order to be able to access those systems. So we have a different set of concerns around that. And it's certainly not uncommon to see organizations that will buy a tool without taking these considerations into effect, will test it in their environment and find that in their test environment it works very well. But when they go to actually deploy it into their organizations, they find that their infrastructure staff, their security teams, or other stakeholders have significant concerns related to those tools and end up not allowing those tools to actually be deployed in the way that they're intended. And as a result of that, you may purchase a tool that would work perfectly well in your environment, but doesn't because of those restrictions. And because of that, you don't end up getting the value that you intended from that investment. So it's absolutely important to make sure that we're looking at those elements and thinking through how those pieces fit together. This also gets into another question that we often get, which is around why is the data often incomplete? And one of the reasons that data is incomplete, of course, is because we keep adding new infrastructure into our environment. So in our traditional data centers, we at least had the ability to, in theory, go in and lay our hands on all the systems that we used within the environment. And we had some ability to access those systems and to have some level of control around whether those systems were on our network, whether they were active in the environment or not. Whether we actually took the steps to make sure that we could actually do those things or not is an entirely separate question. But we, at least in theory, had the ability to do that if we needed to. But of course, one of the biggest trends that we see is that whether we're talking about things like the cloud or investments in containers and microservices, the rise of the Internet of Things, operational technologies, industrial Internet of Things, and other systems at the edge, all of these involve having less control of our systems than what we had today. So we have to ask ourselves the question, if we struggled in order to be able to get a view of the data that we needed within our environment when everything was in our control, what are our chances of being able to have the information that we need across all of these different environments for all the potential use cases that we could have in this world where everything is everywhere within our organizations? Frankly, the answer is that unless we take very deliberate steps and have a strategy for doing so, our odds are not very good that we will be able to do that. So this gets back to the fundamental need of understanding what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Because given the variety of services and systems that you likely have in your organization today, and the fact that we expect this to continue to get more complex in the future, the amount of possible data that could be used is only going to increase. And while tools will evolve to be able to help us with that and to be able to address more and more of those challenges, there's always going to be at least somewhat of a gap between what data we have access to at any given moment and the data that we may need for specific issues. If we don't understand what the needs are that we have to address in order to be successful, our odds of being able to meet those needs effectively become less and less the more and more of these different systems that we introduce into our environment. So this is why we continually come back to the question whenever, anytime a client asks us about what do we need for discovery or how should we best approach what discovery tool to buy, we have to start with the question of what are the goals that we have for the organization and what do we hope that the discovery tool will help us to do. The more that we can focus specifically on specific types of environments and specific needs, the more likely it is that we will be able to identify the right tools and the techniques that we need to be able to use those systems effectively to be able to do the job that's required and to be able to get the kind of results that we want. So for instance, if we're talking about security environments and reducing vulnerabilities within our organizations, then we know that we need to focus on tools that can help us with providing an inventory of the systems that we have, as well as some view of the vulnerabilities that exist related to those items. And that may come through a combination of investing in purpose-built discovery tools, along with vulnerability management systems, or we may be able to make use of tools that we have in our environment, such as a CMDB through a service management tool, or our unified endpoint or client management tools that we use for managing PCs and mobile devices within our environment. And from those systems, we're able to get the data that we need to be able to address these challenges. Now, I mentioned earlier that the leading edge of need versus what tools can provide, it can often be a challenge. So for instance, one of the areas where we are getting more and more questions lately is around the topic of containers. If you're deploying containers into your environment today, there may be some questions that you have regarding what's my ability to discover activity related to those containers. And the answer is that, at least for being able to get some basic information around containers, we're seeing that tools are starting to address those challenges. And likewise for the cloud, our ability to have visibility into those environments is increasing for being able to speak to questions like what systems do we have deployed within that space, what applications are deployed into those environments, what are the elements that make up the containers that are deployed in those organizations. But if our questions become more complex, then our ability to get to that detail becomes rather limited. So for instance, one of the questions that we commonly get asked about is around software licensing within cloud and container environments. Now, in order to be able to speak to licensing demands for certain systems, the answer is quite easy. As long as you can count the number of items that have been deployed, you can compare that to the number of licenses that you purchased for that particular software, and by doing that comparison, it's fairly straightforward. And being able to count those in the cloud or in container environments isn't necessarily that much different than counting them in a traditional environment. But when we start getting into more complex questions around, say, usage of systems or the amount of activity that's going on related to that from a processor or subcapacity licensing or some of those more complex metrics where vendors like Oracle, IBM, VMware, SAP, and others are introducing rules where the amount of systems that are deployed in your environment doesn't necessarily tell you that much about whether you're in compliance or out of compliance with your agreements, then being able to get to that detail is more challenging and complex. Because in those environments, of course, such as the cloud and containers, things are happening so quickly that our traditional approaches to gathering that detail start to become quite limited. Just knowing that you deployed an application into your cloud space doesn't necessarily tell you much about how many people have accessed that system, how many transactions have been processed across that particular device or system, and what is the amount of activity that needs to be charged for related to the agreements. In this case, we have to then go back to our actual software licensing agreements and ask ourselves the question, what are we being measured on related to compliance? And then do we have the ability to gather that detail? And in many instances, we may run into a case where the tools themselves don't provide that information that we need. Or the tools may actually provide that information, but we might have limits in our ability to access that info. So for instance, we've talked to some clients where they would like to be able to optimize their software licensing, where they can measure whether people are using specific software on their PCs and then be able to remove that software if it hasn't been used in a certain amount of time. But getting into that level of detail, especially if what we're looking at is their personal mobile device, may start to run into privacy considerations or limits that might be in place through workers' councils or unions or other sorts of items along those lines. So there again, we have to make sure that we actually understand not only do our tools and systems provide the technical capability to see what we need in our environment, but we also have to understand, do we actually have the right to access that data and the ability to capture it and make use of that? And those sorts of considerations, which didn't come up whenever we were looking at servers in a data center in the old days and we just needed to count how many deployments we had within the environment, are things that we now have to think about in more detail. The more that we start to look into these sorts of challenges, the more that we'll have to wrestle with these items. Now, a lot of this, of course, leads to the question of, well, what does the future of this look like? Is there going to come a point where these sorts of things become simpler and licensing becomes easier to manage across these different environments? If we go back and look at the past 60 years of computing, starting from the IBM 360 and mainframes deployed within their environments, at that point, discovery and licensing was fairly simple because the number of moving parts that we had to track was very small. When we look at a diagram like this one of the current state of our environment, it's very complex. There are a lot of moving pieces and a lot of players that are involved. There is no reason to think that due to the past 60 years of trends around this, that things are going to get simpler in the future. When we start to look at things like packaged business capabilities and being able to swap out particular components of systems, being able to enable citizen-led development with no-code and low-code environments, and the development of those systems. All of those items will have implications for how we license software, how we secure our systems, and how we ensure that we're able to maintain the service levels that are required within our environment. But that doesn't mean that our ability to be able to make good choices and to help our organizations be successful in the future is impossible. What we need to do is to rethink our overall approach to this sort of work and look to find ways in order to unify the various approaches that we've taken to managing these challenges. When I talk with organizations around the world, what I continually and consistently see is that within those organizations, there are many silos of data that have been put into place. The IT asset management team has their data that they use to support their work. You have an architecture team that is managing another set of data. You have a security team that's managing a different set of data. You have I&O teams that are using CMDB tools and monitoring tools and others to manage data. You have apps teams that are using application portfolio management and performance monitoring tools for their systems. And you have more and more business systems that are, of course, also becoming digitalized. And because of that, those systems also have to be tracked and managed so that many of those business teams are also managing their own data sources. Now, in the world that many of us grew up in, like I did, where these systems more or less could operate independently and they didn't necessarily have to share data that often, the downsides to this sort of approach were not too bad. We could do the things that we needed to do, just focus on the data that were relevant to the things that we specifically cared about. Everyone else could do their own thing. And then for the handful of areas where there were touch points, we could work through how to best exchange data between those points in order to be able to accomplish the things that we needed to do within those environments. The world that we are in now, though, is a very different place. If we continue to take this approach of using very siloed views of our environments and using this data independently and not having the ability to bring all this data together in order to be able to answer questions and make changes that are needed for our organization's success, we will start to fall further and further behind organizations that are able to work well across these different boundaries, where we're able to take architecture teams, operations staff, and security teams, and then come together in order to collectively make the best decisions around what investments do we need to make in technology, what are the areas that we need to improve in the most, and how do we make sure that our customers are getting the experience that they need. The best way that I've been able to find for being able to address these siloed challenges and to be able to enable teams from operations, infrastructure, security, architecture, asset management, business teams, and others to be able to work together is by coming together in order to build a common technology asset inventory. Because if we're all referring to systems in the same way and have a consistent view of our environment, that's going to help us to avoid a lot of the challenges that we often see. Many of you may have run into situations like I've run into in the past, where when the CIO asks for reports about how things are going in the environment, the operations staff create a report talking about the servers in the environment and how healthy they've been over the last 30 days. The architects are coming together and showing you information about which servers are up to date and which ones need to be replaced. And the security teams are speaking about the servers that they see in the environment and which ones are vulnerable, which ones are patched and up to date. And often it's only the CIO that realizes that these three lists have entirely different lists of servers within the environment. At that point, of course, the CIO is likely to think that everyone that works for them is an idiot because they don't understand that the same list of servers should, of course, be in place across all of these different environments. But if we're using a common inventory that allows us to be able to share the key data that we need around our environments, we can still have the ability to track the data that only we care about related to those systems in the tools that we need in order to be able to do our jobs on a day-to-day basis. And what this allows us to do is to make sure that whenever we deliver to the CIO our operations report, our lifecycle reports, and our vulnerability reports, that all of those items present the same view. We have the same servers in the list, they're referred to in the same way, and we can start to identify correlations between those areas that, hey, this server is breaking down frequently, and it has a lot of vulnerabilities, and it's out of its service life. That's a very strong candidate for replacement. And now we can all agree on what priorities we should put into place when we start to invest in reducing technical debt. the more that we are able to connect together these different bubbles with a common technology asset inventory so that we can share data across these different environments and to be able to make better decisions by working together more effectively across these areas. We are not only going to be able to make better decisions about our environment, we will also be able to work together more effectively and build better team cohesion within our overall organization. So the future is that investing in the ability to create a technology inventory that allows us to be able to see what we have in our environment, that allows us to address the key questions, will help us to be successful. So how do we start to make this future happen? How do we get there from where we are today? Well, we recommend a few key steps in order to be able to make this happen. We recommend that you follow 5 rules to succeed with discovery and inventory in order to be able to make this work. Rule number 1, start with focusing on where it hurts. And you may have noticed that this is something that I have repeated throughout this session. And the reason I repeat it is because this is something that's absolutely fundamental, yet it is surprising how often it's missed when we look at these sorts of efforts. Your ability to create a complete and accurate inventory does not provide any value whatsoever unless it's used then in order to be able to make improvements to the things that matter most within the organization. So starting with identifying where our pain points are and what our needs are in order to be able to drive better changes in the future is absolutely essential. That also means that before we try to solve all of the problems that we have in our organization, we recommend trying to solve one problem. Because if we can't solve one problem, we're very unlikely to be successful with solving all of our problems. So if we identify the areas that are most in need of support and we can make progress on that item, that will give us very useful knowledge to be able to improve in the future. Next, we then need to be able to get real about what our challenges are within our environment. We need to be able to know who is using the data within our organizations and what they're doing with that data today. It doesn't do us much good to talk about investing in discovery tools if we don't even have a sense of what data exists within our environment, and more importantly, what data people are using within our organizations. Because after all, if we have data that is perfect and complete, but the people that need to use it are still using the same incomplete and inaccurate tools that they have today for that data, we will not get any different results than we're already getting. So we need to make sure that we're focusing on where is data actually being used within our organization? Who are the people that are actually making use of that data? Avoid the temptation to put data into place that may be useful for somebody someday, because someday often never arrives. Instead, focus on the areas where people are actively doing things today, look at the data that they're using for that purpose, and then make sure that they know of better options that exist and that you're working to help to improve those options so that whenever those new tools are installed and those new practices are put into place, that the people that actually need to use that data in order to deliver those results actually do so. Once we do that, of course, we need to also be able to show the benefits of the work that we're doing. We need to be able to speak to what results that we've gotten, because if you're like me in managing and leading teams, it's very easy to forget how bad things used to be once those problems have gone away. Because, of course, there are no shortage of problems to have to pay attention to within our environment. The same is true for our leaders. Unless we take the trouble to baseline what the current level of performance is before we start making improvements to our discovery data so that we can speak to exactly what benefits we've gotten at the end, it's very likely that we'll run into a situation that I see commonly in talking with many organizations, which is that a team of people identify a real issue and they put a lot of time and effort into addressing that issue. And at the end of it, whenever they've made the improvement and they've made a real difference in the environment, no one remembers or recalls how bad things used to be. And the question that's asked is, well, what have you done for me lately? Or, I still have this problem, therefore you failed. we don't want to put ourselves into that sort of a situation. So we need to be able to show the benefits of what we do in a way that is clear and unambiguous so that folks can understand exactly the kind of benefits that we've delivered. Tools are an important force multiplier for the work that we do within our organizations. Tools are an augmentation and a supplementation for the people in your organization. We always have some data that we're using today, even if we have no discovery tools within our environment whatsoever. People are still fixing things that are broke. People are still making decisions on whether to deploy something or not. And they're using some kind of data to do that. That data may just be their own experiences or the experiences of the person next to them when they ask, hey, Joe, do you think I should go ahead and put this into place now or wait till later? But in any case, they're using some kind of data and some sort of a decision mechanism for that work. So what we want to use are tools that will help us to be able to make those decisions faster and more clear, so that whether Joe is actually in the office or not, we can make sure that we're making the best choice at any given time. Tools are absolutely an essential part of the equation, especially when we look at the speed of areas like the cloud and containers and the frequency of changes that are happening in those spaces. The idea that we can somehow manually track all that activity is not feasible. We're going to need systems to help us to do that, but they have to be ones that work with the capabilities and the skills that we have in order for us to be successful around that work. And the last piece that I would recommend is to get fit with the work that we're doing. Make sure that we can ultimately speak to the results that we've got within our organization and that we're making use of the data that we already have. The tools that we bring into place can help us, but ultimately our ability to make a difference and improve our environments it requires us to actually get better at understanding the needs of our organization, where things are going well and where they're not. If we're going to make a dent in the future and be able to change the story around the challenges of discovery and inventory and being able to make better use of that data in order to maximize the value that we're able to get from our technology investments, it's crucial that we get better at being able to use that data in order to guide our own decision making. So in the same way that we ultimately want to make sure that discovery and inventory data supports our future success of our organizations, we also want to make sure that we're positioning ourselves to be able to be successful with using discovery and inventory to help us to address our biggest challenges and to ultimately make sure that we're using the tools and the systems and the investments that we're making in this work in order to position ourselves for a better future. Now with that, I'll turn it back over to Ragip and Isabella in order to talk a bit more about what's going on and to set us up for any questions.
Thank you, Roger. So it's now time to raise everything, a summary together, and but I think, as Ragip already mentioned in the beginning, we will come back to our statement.
Yeah, definitely, Isabella. But first of all, thank you very much, Roger. I hear at the end few keywords or key topics, but I will translate it this way. Around 2,000 years ago, it was 10 rules for the human nature. That's what I read. And today, I like this also more, just 5 rules from Gartner for enterprises for discovery inventory. That's great, and for me, more important than 2,000 years ago. Thank you for this. But I like also the Gartner's vision in integrated technology inventory. I like also the name. Maybe that's not a vision anymore, because this was also 10 years ago our vision. We don't call it that way, but this was our vision, to have something on place where customers, partners, companies, enterprises can bring everything together. So this was our vision, to bring on one hand all the discovery inventory data to manage everything, to manage devices, to manage industrial IT, IIoT, IoT, to manage for mergers and acquisitions and other topic, but especially also the cloud. And we are thinking about this topic and developing together with our partners, with our customers, and also with our great team, a solution in that area. I don't want to go deep in the solution today. On the other hand, with this information, what we have, what we get from all the systems, different scanning technologies, building the bridges between all the areas what Roger explained and make it visible, especially for you to make further actions. That was our ultimate goal at the end. And the cool name, Integrated Technology Inventory. Thank you for this. But on the other hand, the result of Gartner Analytics, especially on the lead from Roger and with Roger's team at Gartner, there have a lot of challenges, a lot of questions about data quality, bring your license, cloud environments, containers, everything what you heard within the last 45 minutes. There is solution on the markets, and you have to just look deeper. That you can do asset tagging. You have a data hub, decentral scan engines, and different technologies. All these challenges has a solution. It's in your hand. Bring those things together, and with help maybe from Raynet to visualize this and take the actions. And therefore, last but not least, before I give it over to Isabella, just a few information. We have a follow-up on this session. We will go deeper in that solutions from Raynet with our follow-up webinar. But on the other hand, a very brand new information since last week, Accenture and Raynet decided to, in one of the biggest innovation center worldwide, to present live this solution, not only for typical office IT or data centers or cloud, combining our technology with every area from the industry, wind parks or machines, and you can see it very soon live in the Innovation Center. These are just my last words, and it will coming soon. We will inform you. Thank you for this, and I give it over to Isabella.
Okay, thank you, Ragip. Thank you, Roger. It was a very interesting and very informative session. Thank you both. Well, it's time for our Q&A session. So if you have any feedback or questions or comments, just use the question panel. I hope you can see it. Just write us your question and we will answer it right here live. But if you want to think about it a little bit and you have question afterwards, just give us a call or send us an email, and we will also contact you.
I think we have some.
Okay. Okay, I think this question is for Raynet. May I please understand how your tool can be different from tools you just mentioned, like Aspera, Flexera, etc.?
Okay, but I think if this the questions are normally going to Roger, but it is a tool question. I want to postpone this question, especially for our next webinar, where we go deeper in our tool set. And hopefully you will see the complete differences. But what I can say is our solution is integrated in Aspera Technologies and as an OEM, and it's called Smart Collect. And the colleagues from Aspera can answer this question also. If you combine the best sites from the asset management industry, Aspera and Raynet, you can have it from Aspera directly. I hope this is enough for the first question.
Okay. Okay, a big thank you from one of the attendees. Another question, is there a comparison table available which I can read through, please?
To Roger, maybe this question.
Yes.
We have analysis of discovery in several markets. And again, as I mentioned at the start of this, the question of discovery is something that covers a lot of different spaces. So of course, comparing a discovery tool that's intended for security vulnerabilities to one that's designed for software licensing in and of itself doesn't provide much value and context. But we do have discovery as an important element of several different markets, such as software asset management tools, IT service management tools, vulnerability assessment, and other systems. And those items are ones that can be used and certainly looked at on our website. So those comparisons in our critical capabilities and magic quadrants, along with our market guides for those areas, can provide very useful info around specific discovery concerns around each of those spaces and how those tools can be used for that purpose. Of course, many other tools can also be used to support discovery more broadly across those different areas. So those items always need to be thought about from the standpoint of what are the areas and the issues and the needs that we have, and how do these different options potentially help us to address those issues. So those resources will be very helpful for anyone that would like to get more into this, who also is a Gartner client.
Yeah. Roger, we discussed this topic several times, and this is, I think, the goal for the market guide for discovery inventory tools, hopefully as soon as possible.
Okay.
We're always looking to meet the needs of our clients.
Yeah, correct. I will explain our partners and clients that they have to ask you and order by Gartner this specific analysis. Okay, there's, I think, another question.
Okay, yes. How do you define inventory pain points if you are highlighting the new horizons like cloud, software as a service, etc.?
This is a critical question, and one that I was happy to hear asked around this, because in many cases, of course, when we start exploring new technologies, there are a lot of things that our teams are trying to get out of those. And in many cases, of course, when we looked at the initial uses of cloud or containers or software as a service, those were often being undertaken by smaller teams in pilots or in newer areas that may not have necessarily been in the traditional IT organization. So where we would recommend, if you're just starting out with exploring these areas and you're trying to figure out the information needs around this, again, it's very tempting to start with either trying to build out a complete view of everything or to try to do the same things that you did in one environment for the other. But of course, trying to track, for instance, the physical location of software as a service is not something that's typically very helpful because by its nature, it's very different from the on-premise environments. What we recommend in those cases, though, would be to work with those teams that are piloting these technologies, that are trying to use these systems in order to understand where are these technologies working well for you, but also what are the challenges that you're facing around that. We as technology professionals know that whenever we look to use new technology, that there are going to be implications for security, for licensing, for how we support and manage requests around those systems. All those elements that make us technology professionals don't go away just because we're using a new technology. but in many cases, of course, the needs are slightly different around those spaces. So in those cases, we want to understand what are the challenges that they're running into, but we also want to ask about how are you making sure that the software that we're using in this environment is licensed for that purpose? Or how are you ensuring that the data in that environment is secured so that we don't lose it if we were to get breached? In many cases, when we start to ask those questions, those teams will start to realize that they do not have very good answers for those questions. And at that point, that then starts to clarify what the needs are for information. And that can then lead to, of course, identifying, well, what are the tools that we may have available from the manufacturer or from others in the marketplace that can help us to be able to answer these questions. And of course, discovery tools may be part of that solution. So asking those questions and looking for the needs that exist in those areas are the best way to be able to get started around these efforts in a way that you're ensuring that what you're investing in is going to translate into value for the overall organization.
Thank you, Roger. So, what do you think, how many companies struggle with a bad data quality?
In my somewhat biased view of the world, I would say 100% of them do, to at least some capacity. I would say the number of organizations that do this well, I can count on one hand in all the time that I've been within organizations. And of course, even if you were one of those mythic companies that was very good at this, say, in 2015, that of course doesn't mean that as new technologies are introduced that those wouldn't start to cause challenges. One of the biggest issues that of course exists for any organization, regardless of how good you are at managing your data today, is how good you are at being able to manage changes to the data over time. Mm-hmm. Many organizations that I talk to, even if I could produce a complete, accurate inventory that told them everything that they wanted to know around all of their systems, within 6 months, that data would be of very little value because so much would have changed and the data would not have changed to be able to keep up with it, so that at the end of that, there would be very little confidence in using the data, and therefore people would not use the data and they would just go back to asking Joe whether I should make this change or not. So what we recommend is that don't focus on whether you're perfect or not, because you inevitably won't be, but instead identify where are the areas that, because we don't have perfect quality data, we suffer. And where you have the biggest opportunities, those are the areas to focus on and to invest in. By investing in those areas and getting less bad, we will improve the value that we're delivering. And ultimately, the goal is not to be perfect. The goal is to be useful and valuable. And if we keep that in mind, we will be able to be much more successful with our future efforts.
Definitely.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. I think these were the perfect words for ending this session today. Yeah. A big thank you to all the attendees, your interest, and of course, Roger and Ragip, thank you so much. For your information, we will contact you and send you, of course, a slide deck, and we will provide you as well the recording of this session. And if you have any questions left, just contact us, and we will be happy to answer everything.
Definitely, okay. But also thank you from my side to Gartner, to Roger. But visit us soon at Accenture Garching IoT Center, plus the next session also from my side. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.